in Matthew, the 14th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
Now when Jesus heard about the beheading of John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The Gospel of the Lord. Banquets. You remember them? Those big meal events that we used to have when people gathered together. You know, the end of the sports season comes and off you went to the Elks Club in Essexville. I think we were there 8 times, and every time we had chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. All of you who've done the sports banquet know what the menu is going to be. Or maybe you were planning a wedding, and there was going to be a lot of people come, and they bring a lot of gifts, so that's why you invite a lot of people to weddings. It's kind of a lucrative event. My brother-in-law used to think it was a sort of a scam to bring all those people, but there was food, and there was fellowship, and there was fun, and people really enjoyed themselves. Or we have banquets to celebrate the completion of a project. Maybe we finish a building or finish a campaign and people are invited in. Or there are banquets that are set to raise money for political campaigns in which we invite people in and they spend way more than the chicken is worth, but you get some influence and access and you provide some financial support to somebody that you want to have run for office. But the thing that all banquets have in common, no matter which of those, is that they are usually by invitation only. You had to play in that sport to get to come to the sports banquet. You had to be part of the families and friends to be able to come to the wedding. You were invited to come to the event that wrapped up the campaign or the building project because you've been a donor to that. You had to come to the political thing because they thought you had some money that you could hand over to them, or you're willing to pay $1,000 for a piece of chicken. Invitation only is how we perceive a banquet. It's the place to which folks are brought who ought to be there. And some of them are people who think they deserve to be there. They have done a worthy thing to establish their credibility to arrive at this particular event. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. Don't think this is kind of a late 20th century or 21st century thing. Banquets have often been used for invitation only. Even in the days of Jesus and the days of the prophet Isaiah, banquets are ways to bring people together to signify the conclusion of something or to exercise political power and influence. So in the days of Isaiah, there were often banquets to celebrate the completion of a temple. So a temple was built and people were invited to come and they could then celebrate that that had been done. As we know, Jesus' friend Herod often had banquets celebrating birthdays and other things. He would have entertainment, and he'd bring his friends together. But what he was really doing was consolidating his power, bringing things together. Now, those banquets often left people out. In fact, sometimes people got in trouble for them. You know, as you know, at the banquet that Herod just had right before Jesus, the gospel reading for today, John the Baptist lost his head. So it was not a great banquet for John. But Herod had made a deal, and he said something, and next thing he knew, he had to come through because that's what people expect. But God seems to want to reverse the way that we think about these banquets. God seems not to be interested in inviting people who deserve to be there, but rather opens up the door to invite everyone there. And oftentimes people that we don't think ought to be coming, or people who didn't do anything to get there, or people who didn't pay anything to participate. Isaiah says it quite clearly, "Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the water, come without money, come without price." It's a free lunch. We all like a free lunch. We all want something for nothing. It's a really great event. And if you're on the outside looking in, if you've often been sitting around watching other people banquet, suddenly to hear God say, you get to come and eat, it's a marvelous moment in which God has sort of changed the rules, no longer looking just for the people who deserve to be there, but inviting all people to become part of the banquet. And then even inviting those who've come to the banquet to invite others to come to the banquet, people that are outside the fold, so to speak. People that are farther down the road. Jesus seems to do exactly the same thing. And in feeding those 5,000 plus who gathered around him, he's really overturning the banquet that Herod had just done in which he killed his friend John. Now, Jesus really didn't want to have a banquet that day. Jesus wanted to get away. He was really disappointed or saddened by the death of John. And yet when the crowds came, Jesus' initial reaction is compassion. And there's healing, and then there's feeding, and then there's care. And it seems like he doesn't have a whole lot. 5 loaves, 2 fish for all those people isn't going to do it. Nevertheless, he simply wants them to eat and to be satisfied and to receive the gift that God has for them. God's banqueting rules are different than the way that we operate. God's table manners are different from the way we operate. And not everybody's happy about that, right? Especially people who can afford to buy their way to the front of the line are never really happy when it says everyone in the back gets to come too. That's not fair. They didn't do as much. There's other parables that reflect upon that whole sense of fairness in God's agenda. But it's just the way that we operate. What? I can't get an advantage because I have resources? No, says God. Paul gets really frustrated because he can't understand why the Israelites, his own brothers and sisters, aren't excited that other people get to come and eat. So he writes to the Romans, he's just like really irritated that they won't understand that God wants to expand the table. That God seems to be lowering the entrance requirements. And how dare God do that? Let those other kinds of people in. We worked hard to get this status. But what's really ironic is when people who have been received into a community by the grace and love of God turn into people who try to keep other people out. Our participation in the community of faithful is not because of anything we have done, but because of God's invitation. And yet once we get invited, we suddenly decide to become gatekeepers to keep other people out. But ultimately, God doesn't care how we want to operate the banquet. God continues to bring people in. God continues to open the table. God continues to welcome sinners and saints alike. Without money, without price, without sort of any preconceived expectation of what you might bring to the table. Because God's table, God's banquet is open to all. And God's invitation is open to all. And God invites us to become inviters. People who feel like they don't belong. But we know they do, because they too are children of God.